Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 284, Islam Makhachev defeated Alexander Volkanovski via controversial unanimous decision. And a couple days later, we have a teammate of Alexander Volkanovski, UFC lightweight Dan Hooker, making massive accusations towards Islam Makhachev, outright saying that Makhachev cheated and violated the USADA banned list rule in the lead up to UFC 284 to gain an advantage in his fight with Alexander Volkanovski. We're going to take a look at what Dan Hooker tweeted out. We're also going to talk about an interview with Alexander Volkanovski via the MMA Hour, where Volkanovski hints at the same accusations that Dan Hooker makes. We're going to talk about whether or not there's any proof behind these accusations, and we're also going to discuss if these accusations are proven to be true, what will happen to Islam Makhachev? Will he be stripped of the UFC lightweight title? So before we get into all those different things, let's talk about a little bit of background of this situation. Obviously, most of us know Islam Makhachev defeated Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 284. It was a controversial decision. You have a lot of fans that believe that Alexander Volkanovski should have got his hand raised. You have, fighters in the crowd who are teammates of Volkanovski from City Kickboxing. You have Dan Hooker, Israel Adesanya, and Kai Kara France, and probably plenty of others that believe that Alexander Volkanovski should have got his hand raised at UFC 284. I talk about this fight in depth on my live post-fight, as well as I did an individual video talking about whether or not this fight was a robbery. If you want to check out either one of those videos, I will link them down in the description, as well as the end cards, because I'm not going to rehash all that right here. Well, you also have a past between Islam Makhachev and Dan Hooker, where at one point in time, Dan Hooker was ranked above Islam Makhachev. Makhachev wanted the Dan Hooker fight, and Dan Hooker kind of said, I'm not fighting him, he's behind me. And then you had a situation where eventually Makhachev leapfrogged Dan Hooker in the rankings. Dan Hooker was kind of having a career slide, losing a couple fights. And now Dan Hooker was looking up in the rankings at Islam Makhachev and calling out Islam Makhachev, and Makhachev was saying, I don't want the Dan Hooker fight anymore. I'm fighting up. I want to, get close to a title shot. And so you had a situation at one point in time where Makhachev was claiming that Dan Hooker was ducking him, and then once they flipped in the rankings, you had a situation where Dan Hooker was claiming Islam Makhachev was ducking him. Well, ultimately, they ended up fighting at UFC 267 when Rafael Dos Anjos pulled out of the fight. And Dan Hooker took this fight on, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks' notice. Islam Makhachev, I knew he's still taking an opponent on short notice, but he was already scheduled to fight on this card. And Makhachev went out there, immediately took Dan Hooker down, and then submitted him via Kimura very early in the first round. And, I know this backstory seems like it's not super relevant, but I just want to mention all these things because when you have a guy that's making massive accusations, you kind of have to understand where these accusations come from. Now, we're going to take a look at Dan Hooker's tweets. It's going to be from bottom to top, chronological order. The first tweet that Dan Hooker put out was, dumb cunt thinks he can fly to Australia, hire a nurse to give him an IV, and we won't find out. Cheating dog. Then he tweeted out, prove me wrong, bet you can. And then he also tweeted out, he doesn't cheat, he doesn't win. And then the last tweet was him quoting someone, asking him, who are you talking about, based on these tweets? And he says, Islam is a cheat. And for those of you who don't know, an IV used to be commonplace in MMA. And what it used to be was for people who cut weight and essentially, people who cut a lot of weight, after the weigh-in, they would rehydrate with an IV. And it was better to rehydrate that way. They could get rehydrated faster than being able to rehydrate orally. And it was banned when USADA came in because essentially there's people that use it as a masking agent. So you use some type of other performance enhancing drug, and then you use the rehydration to help get it out of your system. And so when USADA came in, they banned it. It was no longer allowed to be used. And essentially what Dan Hooker's saying is that Islam Makhachev had a bad weight cut, which we're going to talk about that here in a second. And then he used the IV to rehydrate, therefore, getting an advantage in the fight rather than just rehydrating in a normal capacity. So in these tweets, as you've seen, I put them on the screen, Dan Hooker does not provide any evidence of the claims that he's making. But it is strange that he's making these claims And you also have Volkanovski, who this interview was pre-recorded, where he made a couple, hints at the same claims that Dan Hooker made. And I think this is very interesting because if these are true, this will be massive ramifications for the lightweight division. But right now, there is no true validity to these claims. We have absolutely no evidence. All we have is Dan Hooker tweeting out that Islam Makhachev rehydrated using an IV. And just because you use rehydration using an IV, it doesn't necessarily mean you're using PEDs. It's just a way that people use to mask PED use. But in Islam's case, it could be used just for rehydration, but nonetheless, it's banned and he shouldn't be doing it. And there's been instances, at least one off the top of my head, that I will talk about here in a second, of what happens when people get caught using these IVs. It's a little bit of a weird situation because they used to be basically encouraged by the UFC, and basically everyone used to use them. And supposedly there's a test to be able to tell if you use an IV, but there was a lot of fighters. And there was another tweet by Dan Hooker that I kind of left out that wasn't really relevant. Jose Aldo famously said when the ban came out that, you're going to have to put a security guard on me if you don't think I'm going to use an IV. It's very hard to detect a fighter using an IV, but supposedly there's a test, but I don't know how long that test can last to be able to tell that they took rehydration via an IV. But it's only supposed to be used, even out of competition, it's only supposed to be used when medically necessary, and they still have to get a therapeutic use exemption. So no matter what reason, if Islam Makhachev used an IV to rehydrate, he's going to get in serious trouble with the UFC and USADA. But right now, there's no evidence of these claims. And also, I saw that Dan Hooker was hanging out with Oscar Willis from the Mac Life, and it appeared, Oscar Willis posted it on his Instagram story, it appeared around the time that Dan Hooker tweeted this out that he looked like he was intoxicated. So that also adds another layer. You have the checkered past between Dan Hooker and Islam Makhachev, and you have the fact that he's out intoxicated tweeting these claims out. Most likely, he seemed intoxicated in the video, but it was a short video. So now I'm thinking, okay, this just seems like Dan Hooker's kind of salty that his teammate lost. But then you have the fact that Volk, before Dan Hooker put out these tweets, because the interview from Alexander Volkanovski that he did on the MMA Hour was pre-recorded, I guess because of timing for Volkanovski, and then it aired right before I did this video. Volkanovski, within the interview, made a couple claims about Islam Makhachev using an IV. He kind of just hinted at it, and Ariel Helwani didn't follow up because he didn't have the information about the Dan Hooker's tweets, because the Dan Hooker's tweets yet hadn't even happened yet when this interview happened. So we really didn't get any more information. But the fact that Volkanovski is throwing this out there, especially when he's just doing an interview with the MMA Hour, leads me to believe there's something to this. But at this point in time, there's no real evidence. They haven't, if you're going to make a claim, you should put the evidence out there of the reason you're making the claim. Because if Islam gets caught, there could be real ramifications. The only time off the top of my head that I can remember a fighter getting caught using an IV was Paulo Costa. And he was caught using an IV. I think one of his teammates posted a video in the hotel, and Costa was using an IV to rehydrate. Costa was subsequently suspended for 6 months. But this is a different situation because Islam Makhachev is the champion. So what happens if he's found guilty of using this IV? Should he be stripped of the belt? I think based on the rules of USADA, he probably should. But will the UFC actually do that? I think if these accusations are proven true, I don't believe the UFC will strip Islam Makhachev. I think it'll be one of those things where it's like, okay, he shouldn't have done it, but he was just rehydrating. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, he looked terrible on the scale. People have been saying that for years about so many fighters. This fighter looks terrible on the scale. We have so many internet doctors nowadays claiming, oh, this picture shows this and this and that, and steroids. They're diagnosing steroid use off of Instagram pictures. And there was actually somebody posting a picture. It was Islam Makhachev in the lead up, the week of the fight, that the UFC has took some promotional pictures. And there was people saying, oh, it looked like there's an IV mark on his arm. These pictures would have been taken early on in fight week, so those are no evidence because he wouldn't even have taken the IV at this point in time. So it's a very strange circumstance, but I believe what will happen, if it's proven that Makhachev used an IV to rehydrate, I believe he will be suspended for 6 months, and I believe the UFC will let him hang on to the belt. Will they give Volkanovski a rematch because of this? I don't know. They might already do that anyway. But I think the UFC is going to kind of sweep it under the rug, not pretend like it's a massive deal, but it should be a massive deal. If you are cheating, if you are going against the USADA rules and you're not being punished for it, then what's the point of even having USADA? That's my thoughts on it. But honestly, what do I actually think is going to come of this situation? I don't truly believe anything's going to come out of this. I don't know why Dan Hooker's tweeting this out. I don't know why Volk is saying, what he's saying, hinting at it, without any evidence. If there was evidence, I believe they would have posted the evidence. So I believe ultimately what's going to happen is they said this. I think a lot of MMA fans are going to run with it. There's a lot of MMA fans that already hate Islam Makhachev, that already believe, Islam Makhachev's a cheater and already believe, he's a weight bully in the weight class. And they're going to take Dan Hooker's tweets. They're going to take Volkanovski hinting at it. And they're going to say, yeah, he definitely did it, even with absolutely no evidence. I'm wondering if this is one of those situations where somebody saw something out of the ordinary, maybe at the Fighters Hotel or something, and then a rumor kind of started. It got to Dan Hooker, and then it got to Volkanovski, and they don't know for sure, but they heard these claims, and now they're thinking, okay, maybe Islam Makhachev did use the IV to rehydrate, and now we're going to kind of throw these claims out there. And maybe Volkanovski thought, okay, I'm going to hint at it in this interview, but nobody's ever going to think anything of it because I haven't come out and made the flat out accusations, and didn't expect Dan Hooker to go out there and make these claims so abruptly on Twitter. But honestly, I feel like with no evidence, and I will make another video if more evidence appears, but right now it just looks like, Volkanovski and the whole City Kickboxing team is just sour about losing to Islam Makhachev, especially when you have the fact, we go to the Dan Hooker backstory with Islam Makhachev. It just is a really bad look, in my opinion. We talk about it all the time. When fighters lose and they come out and claim, I was injured afterwards, or, I was drunk the night before, to bring up another Paulo Costa reference. And now you have Dan Hooker kind of saying, well, Volkanovski wouldn't have lost. And I know he didn't say this, but he's essentially saying, well, Volkanovski probably would have won if it wasn't for Islam Makhachev cheating to rehydrate. And also, people are going to make a lot of, because of Australia and because of the way they did the weigh-ins, there was less time to rehydrate after the weigh-ins than there is normally with the way the UFC does the weigh-ins timing and the actual fight. There was less time to rehydrate for Islam Makhachev. But I think until there's more information, I think this is a bad look for Dan Hooker. I think it's a bad look for Volkanovski. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. But if you're going to make these types of accusations, you should probably have evidence to support it. And right now, they just look like they're sour that they lost the fight and that they ultimately did not get the decision. And more on Dan Hooker's part than Volkanovski. He kind of joked about it a little bit. He didn't harp on it. He didn't claim, outright what Dan Hooker did. So I think it's more on Dan Hooker, but I think overall it's a bad look for City Kickboxing. But I'll be very interested to see what more information may come out about Islam Makhachev potentially rehydrating, and if he is found to be guilty of hiring a nurse, which that doesn't really add up to me because I'm pretty sure all those guys can figure out how to rehydrate using an IV without hiring a nurse in Australia. That doesn't pass the sniff test for me. But if this does come to fruition and this is proven accurate, I am curious what course the UFC takes. Do they strip Islam Makhachev? I find that hard to believe. I think he'll be suspended for 6 months, which really doesn't matter. There's fighters, most champions fight twice a year anyway, so 6 months isn't even a real suspension, and they'll probably just sweep it under the rug. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Do you think there's any merit to these claims? What do you think the UFC should do if Islam Makhachev is, found guilty of using an IV? I'm genuinely curious. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.